in there to do that melody, to me, the song or this tune overall would sound a bit more plainer. And I was looking for something a little bit more on the other side of things. Let me play it back for you one more time. Now, right there towards that section, or in that section where the volume kind of pushes up a bit and more instruments come in, that melody line, if you will, is still there, but it's kind of pushed down into the mix or behind the other instruments, but it's still recognizable. So as a listener, there's that consistent theme that you can kind of lock your ear onto, though it's not right in your face. And again, using these atypical sounds, as I'm calling it, I believe that's a good strategy for keeping your melody in the mind of the listener, because you're doing it in a subtle way by using what I see as subtle instrumentation or weird sounds to create this melody. I'm hoping this makes sense. This is a bit more abstract concept, but I'm sure you guys have heard some of this stuff from some of the popular artists out there. I've heard it a ton of times. I heard a track where they did something, I alluded to a cowbell earlier, with a cowbell, or they use a series of blips or beeps, and that becomes the melody. And quite frankly, had a lot of that when the whole dubstep craze was going on. You just had a series of like these weird kind of jagged sounds, and the accumulation of these sounds became the melody. So the point is, try to think outside of your typical instruments or your typical patches on your keyboard or in your digital audio workstations for your melodies. Try to think a bit further outside of where you've been in terms of sound selection for your melody. All right, let's move on to our last concept here. Now, this is kind of skewing towards the mixing part of the music, meaning how all of the instruments are going together. Now, this song, as I said before, is quite rough. It's not finished in any stretch, by any stretch. But when we start talking about mixing and how the sounds go together, as a musician or as a producer, you're trying to figure out, hey, when someone ultimately listens to the song, what do I want them to feel? What kind of experience will they have? So I'm going to kind of move in that direction just a bit with this next tip. Now, I like to have a mixture of dry sounds and wet sounds when I am creating music. So dry, wet. What in the world am I talking about? Well, you've probably seen these words, if you think about it, in your digital audio workstation, if you use one. This is especially true when you're dealing with things like delay. And today I want to focus on reverb or some other type of effect like chorus or what have you. Dry and wet. If you experiment with that with your sound effects plugins on your digital audio workstation, you'll realize that the more you turn your dial or your slider, your fader towards dry, the plainer and less echoey or less exciting, potentially, the sound is. And the more you move in the wet direction is the more you provide more of that particular sound effect. If it's, again, delay or flange or chorus, a chorus sound, it becomes really, really, really thick and heavy. And it's pretty obvious when you start sliding in that direction. Here's the point for my tip here. When I am putting down my various instruments in this music segment, some instruments are completely dry. They have zero reverb and delay or effect on them. And there are other instruments I purposely make them a bit wetter with various types of sound effects. For today, as I mentioned before, I'm using reverb to make some of the sounds a bit wetter. So I'm going to play this track one more time, not the whole thing. See if you can pick out some of the dry and wet sounds. And then I'm going to go back and isolate these dry and wet sounds. And you're going to hear a very, very clear demonstration of what I'm talking about. Let me go back and play it for you. Here we go. Okay. So all the instruments are kind of going together, and it's really hard. It may be hard to pick out the dry and the wet sounds inside of the mix, but I'm sure you were able to hear just a few elements in there that were dry and wet. Now, before I go further into this, why worry about having a mixture of dry and wet? Again, this is how I produce my music. The reason why I have a combination of dry and wet sounds is to create depth in my mix, in my sound. If everything has reverb on it, or if everything is dry, I feel that it makes your music and the sound of your music collectively very one-dimensional. But when you add a mixture of sounds within your song, I believe that it creates more depth and more interest, and it seems less like a cut and paste scenario, like you just grabbed a sample and just looped it. But you took the time to get in there and to put things in strategic places to accommodate that listening experience, or to enhance that listening experience. So that is why I like to use a combination of dry and wet sounds. It gives your music more interest. It gives it more character in my estimation. Now, before I play the dry and wet portions of this music, let me give you guys an example of the difference, or the comparison between a dry and wet sound. I'm going to just play a sound effect for you. And this is just a percussion sound. And I forget what kind of sound this is. This is more like some kind of a shaker sound. I'm going to play it for you, and it's going to be a dry shaker sound. Take a listen. There it is. That's a shaker. I'll play it one more time. So when the sound plays, as soon as it's done, there's dead silence. There's nothing kind of hanging on. There's nothing stretching the sound out. There's no echo. There's no delay. There's nothing like a millisecond behind that sound. It's just over and done with. Let me play it one more time. All right, there you go. Now, in this instance, in what we're talking about for today in terms of the wet part of the mix here, I'm going to throw reverb on that same sound you heard. Now, I'm going to go and exaggerate it by like a crazy amount to give you a difference between a dry sound and a wet sound. And I'm putting the reverb on this, the reverb plugin, to really accentuate this dry sound to where it's going to sound very echoey. So one more time on the dry, and then I'm going to immediately play the wet. So here's the dry, and here is the wet. Very different sound. One more time. Dry. Here is wet. If you think about it, and when you're listening to both these sounds, they are almost, well, they're so different that they don't sound like the same thing in essence. And that's another part of me bringing this up. If you use the right, well, again, this is a lot of reverb. I mean, a huge amount of reverb. If you use the right amount of wetness in your track, you can transform it from just one thing to the other, you know, of course, based off of the style of music that you're producing. But again, there's a vast difference between that dry sound and that wet sound. So let me play it one more time. Here's the dry version of it, and here's the wet version of it. Completely different. Now, that wet sound, again, it's kind of way overboard. I'm going to scale it back just a bit to where it's not so far out there. Here's another wet version of it, but it's not as big and grand. Yeah, that still sounds kind of big. Let me scale it back just a bit more. I feel like I'm not getting anywhere. Let's try this one more time. Let me move this down substantially, see if we can get a bigger difference here in sound. There we go. That sounds like something happening in a small little room or almost a closet. Whereas the other one sounded as though you're in some crazy, long, spacious echo hall. That's a bit bigger, sounds like a larger room or a basement type of sound. All right, I'm not going to go further into the different types of reverb here. The point is, I simply wanted to give you a clear example between wet and dry. So let's go back to that track here, and I'm going to give you the dry portions of the track and then the wet portion. So to make today's episode a bit easier, I took all of my instruments and I routed them into a bus or into like a kind of a folder. And so all the dry stuff that you're going to hear right now, it's all together. And mainly you're going to hear percussion and looks like my synth bass. So let me play those portions of the track only. And mind you, they are all ultra dry. Take a listen. There you go. That is the dry portion of the track. So when you heard, or the song, when you heard the song earlier, those dry things, as you just heard them, that's how they're playing in the overall mix and the collection of sound there. And so that's what's going on. Now, let me play the wet portions of this track for you, the parts that actually contain reverb. So now what you're going to hear is only instrumentation that has some level of reverb in them. And you may hear some other stuff like some small delay. Here we go. So when you hear that, especially as it gets towards the end, it has this bigger, open, it has this bigger, more open sound to it, like a larger, grander sound. Whereas the dry instruments, they seem to be very dull and kind of just restricted to a certain degree. But again, if you put them together, now you have things that are kind of operating in different aspects of the sound spectrum, if I can call it that. I'm kind of making up stuff. But collectively, they just work together. So let's take a cruise through this music segment one more time and listen for both together. Take a listen. There it is. So again, try to play around with that and go through some of the other concepts I mentioned today. Even if you don't want to use some of the things I mentioned as regular things that you do in your music, meaning with the whole melody thing, using different sounds for your melody or your intervals, just try playing around with them on a sample song just to practice different ways of doing things. The more you can do that, the more diverse your production and songwriting skills will be. And I'm telling you, man, you will see more success in this music game. Yo,